To fully understand the Haunted Mansion, we're going to need to head all the way back to its beginning, which, surprisingly enough, actually predates the park itself. Now, the concept of a Haunted Mansion had been something floating around at Disney since pretty much the beginning of when Walt wanted to make a theme park. One of the main reasons it's so hard to pinpoint an actual time when someone first came up with the idea is because it had pretty much always been there in some form or another. When the concept was first starting out, the idea was for the Haunted Mansion to actually be a walkthrough style haunted house, with tour guides taking small groups of guests through the mansion one at a time. It would still be almost another 5 years worth of development before the idea of turning the attraction into a ride was even considered. The initial idea for the attraction came from Walt, who wanted a type of haunted attraction somewhere in Disneyland, something that had a bit of a more mature theme and could entertain an older crowd amongst the other more kid-friendly attractions. In its early stages, there really wasn't any solid idea for the attraction itself, besides it being a pretty standard haunted house. Instead, most of the focus was put on designing its exterior facade. Some of the earliest pieces of concept art for the Haunted Mansion, or as it was called back then, the walkthrough ghost house, were done by Harper Goff, one of Disneyland's main conceptual artists. Originally, the idea was to put the house on the park's main street, but on an offshoot a little bit further back than the other buildings at a dead end. This also somewhat tied into a few of Harper's earlier concepts that were now a little bit more simplified. After that, a few different ideas were all considered for how exactly the house should look, with other wed artists like Marvin Davis and Sam McKim also pitching out their own ideas for its design. Eventually, they all came to an agreement on a 19th century Gothic-style house on a crooked path leading up from Main Street. However, that idea didn't exactly last for too long after Disneyland officially opened in 1955. Seeing as how they didn't leave any room for their new haunted house attraction on or around Main Street, they now had to move it somewhere else in the park. After that, the ghost house was then relocated to an unused area in Frontierland. From there, the idea sat for a few more years without any real additions or improvements. It wasn't until about 1957 that the attraction's concept was officially picked back up. By that point, Disneyland had been open for a few years and was already very well received by a majority of its guests. The obvious next step for the park was expansion. A few months later, Disney began work on their newest addition, a brand new section of the park by the name of New Orleans Square. The new area would actually be a rethemed piece of the pre-existing Frontierland with a few new shops and restaurants. But if you remember from earlier, the Ghost House was recently moved to Frontierland, and more specifically, the same part of it that would now become New Orleans Square. Once it was decided that the mansion was going to be in the new section of the park, they began to redesign its exterior to better fit the new surrounding theming. That task was ultimately given to Ken Anderson, who was an animator for the company. Anderson then drew up some new pieces of concept art for the facade, now giving it a more 18th century plantation style, mostly based off the Shipley Lydecker house over in Baltimore. Anderson's new concept for the antebellum style house was then brought to Walt, who liked the design but wasn't a big fan of the overgrown and dilapidated state the house was in. He didn't really like the idea of having a run-down and decrepit building anywhere within his otherwise pristine park, so from that point on the decision was made to have the mansion's exterior be well kept and preserved, while its interior would be old and run down. Not too long after Walt approved the revised concept, construction began on the mansion, alongside the rest of the New Orleans Square expansion. Over the next year, Disney constructed the mansion's facade and its surrounding area. After Anderson had finished designing the exterior of the mansion, he began to focus his efforts as to what all was inside it. Over the next few years, he drew up numerous pieces of concept art for various scene ideas he had come up with. Over time, and with the help of some of the other Imagineers on the project, those same ideas later turned into full-blown storylines for the haunted house. One of the first ideas he came up with was to base the attraction's backstory off a character named Captain Gore, an ex-pirate who was forced to kill his wife after she found out about his past. After that, he was then haunted by her until he eventually hung himself. Another idea was that the mansion was an actual real-life haunted house. It wasn't until after Disney had purchased and moved it from Louisiana to California that he found out all of the ghost stories surrounding it were actually real. If you've ever been on the ride yourself, you'll note that a lot of these same ideas ended up in the final version of it. The stories aren't as explicitly stated as they are here, but some of the elements are there. In 1958, Ken Anderson left the project to work on the upcoming Disney film Sleeping Beauty. In his place, Walt brought on Imagineers Raleigh Crump and Yale Gracie. Together, the two worked on new illusions and special effects to be used throughout the attraction. Not too long after that, Raleigh Crump also began work on the attraction's post-show, a new concept he called the Museum of the Weird, which would be an exhibit showcasing different oddities from around the world. Fast forward about 5 years later to 1963, and the Haunted Mansion's facade, as well as its new surrounding land, were both finished in terms of their construction. The only issue was the attraction itself wasn't anywhere near finished. For the most part, work on other projects ended up getting prioritized over the mansion and continually pushed back its development, namely the attractions Disney was creating for the 1964 World's Fair, things like the Ford Skyway, It's a Small World, and the Carousel of Progress. It wasn't until after the World's Fair was finished that work really picked back up on the attraction. Around this same time, two more Imagineers joined on the project as well, those two being Mark Davis and Claude Coates, both of which were tasked with creating new story elements and tying the pre-existing ones together. Sometime later that year, the world got its first sneak peek of the Haunted Mansion on The Wonderful World of Color, Walt Disney's TV show.
Mark, I want you to meet Julie Ream.
Mark Davis.
Very nice to Julie is Miss Disneyland Tencennial. And Mark Davis is the master in charge of our House of Illusions, or what do we call it?
A haunted mansion.
Haunted mansion and supernatural.
From that episode, we can tell that effects like the stretching portraits, the changing portraits, and the infamous Pepper's ghost were all established illusions that would eventually make their way into the mansion. Really, all there was left to do now was work out some of the attraction's logistics, and they could begin construction on its show building and later debut the attraction. But the Imagineers pretty quickly ran into a few issues. One of the biggest problems they faced was capacity. You see, if the Haunted Mansion were to be a walkthrough as Walt had originally intended, its hourly capacity would have been extremely low, only allowing a couple hundred people through per hour, and in a park as popular as Disneyland was at that point, that just wouldn't have worked. Now, this wasn't exactly a new issue. Disney had known that capacity was going to be an issue as far back as when Ken Anderson was still on the project. Since then, there had been a few different ideas on how they could convey guests through the attraction that never really stuck, mainly because of the fact that Walt really wanted the attraction to be a walkthrough. In trying to keep it that, Imagineers experimented with a lot of potential solutions. They considered removing certain scenes, to moving the Museum of the Weird to the front of the attraction so it would now function as a pre-show, to even suggest building a second identical walkthrough so they could, in theory, double their hourly capacity. But after a while of being unable to find an effective workaround, Haunted Mansion's development stopped yet again. It wasn't until after Walt Disney's death in 1966 that the Imagineers picked back up on the project, now with the idea to turn it into an Omnimover style ride like the People Mover or Adventure Through Inner Space. Now that the Haunted Mansion was officially a ride, all of its original scenes had to be redesigned to fit the new track layout. Along with that, and now that they had a better idea of the space they'd have to work with, new scenes were also created, utilizing some of the emerging technology, like audio animatronics for example. But as all these new additions and improvements were coming about, there began to be some debate amongst the Imagineers over the attraction's storyline. This, of course, led to one of the most infamous battles of ideas in Imagineering history. Basically what had happened was that WED was split into two groups, the Mark Davis group, who favored a more lighthearted and family-friendly ride, and the Claude Coates group, who pictured a darker and more scary experience for the mansion. The debates went on for some time, with Imagineers on both sides arguing why their version of the ride was better. However, the two sides eventually reached an agreement in 1967, thanks to Xavier Atencio to combine both ideas into the attraction. Now, the first part of the ride would be the foreboding and scary experience that Coates wanted, while the latter half would be the more jovial and lighthearted one that Davis had envisioned. After that, Atencio revisited all the different backstories that the Imagineers had come up with over the years, essentially combining the best elements of all of them into the attraction. He also put together the final script for the ride's narration and wrote the lyrics for Grimm's Grinning Ghost, the same song that later plays in the graveyard. But once all the planning had wrapped up, Disney began construction on the attraction's show building and subsequently installed all of its set pieces and animatronics. By the time they were finished with all that in 1969, the attraction was finally ready to be opened. After over 15 years of development, Disney officially opened the Haunted Mansion on August 9th of 1969. The mansion very quickly gained traction and became one of the most popular dark rides in the park, and for the most part, the mansion's popularity kept it from being altered in any major way, which is more than I can say for some other classic Disney attractions from that same time period. By and large, the ride we see today is near identical to the same one guests first saw almost 50 years ago. However, there have been quite a few changes or additions to the mansion, so let's go through those now. Keep in mind that when a ride is this old, there are going to be countless minor changes throughout it. Pretty minute stuff like pictures on the walls getting changed or some set pieces getting moved around, stuff like that is bound to happen quite a bit, so for this next section we'll just be focusing on the bigger changes. Sometime in the mid-1980s, Disney added a night in the corridor of doors scene towards the beginning of the ride. What most riders were unaware of was that it was actually a costume cast member who had suddenly come to life. The new addition proved to be very effective when it came to getting in a quick scare, so much so that it had to be stopped only a couple years later, due to the fact that the knight was either punched or had something thrown at him on multiple different occasions. What we see now in its place is an audio animatronic knight that really doesn't do too much of anything. The next change can be found in Madame Leota's seance room. Besides the multiple upgrades her projection saw over the years to make the illusion more convincing, they also recently changed it so that her crystal ball is now floating as opposed to just sitting on the table like it originally did. The ballroom scene also saw similar changes in terms of its lighting effects and updated animatronics sometime in the 80s, but nothing too noticeable or different from its original version. Next up is the attic scene. In the attic, the main focus point is undoubtedly the bride character, but the animatronic itself has gone through quite a few changes in the last couple of decades, being redesigned in the late 70s and again towards the end of 1995. Eventually she was replaced altogether in 2006 with an entirely new character named Constance. The new animatronic also came with an official backstory, that being that she killed all of her husbands with a hatchet. There also used to be some pop-up ghosts in the attic as well, but those were eventually removed in 2006 alongside the original bride. Another more minor change in the attic was a shadow of a ghost playing a broken down piano on one of its walls. The effect was added sometime in the 90s and was actually based off one of the original Ken Anderson concepts for the attraction, way back when it was still a walkthrough. However, the most infamous change in the attic, and perhaps the entire attraction, came in 2015 when Disney added a character called the Hatbox Ghost, an animatronic figure whose head would disappear and then reappear in the hatbox he was holding. The Hatbox Ghost was actually an opening day effect that guests back in 1969 were actually able to see before it got removed a few months later. Ultimately, they removed the Hatbox Ghost because the ambient lighting in the attic just about always made both heads visible at the same time and pretty much ruined the effect. In more recent years, Haunted Mansion fans had become so interested in the forgotten about Hatbox Ghost that Disney ended up bringing him back just a few years later, now with new technology that made the effect work as originally intended. Besides all those changes, there really haven't been any other major ones to the ride. A few upgrades to its lighting and animatronics in the graveyards, as well as some updates to its queue to better handle capacity, but really nothing story-wise was significantly altered, aside from its yearly Nightmare Before Christmas seasonal overlay, but there's more than enough changes in that alone to warrant its own separate video, so expect that soon enough. In reality, the Haunted Mansion hasn't actually been changed all that much, especially when you consider how frequently other attractions from that same era have been. And it's not that hard to see why. The ride itself is iconic. Nowhere at Disney or anywhere else are you going to find an attraction as interesting, creative, and groundbreaking as the Haunted Mansion. And on top of that, it's just a really entertaining ride. Everything from its really morbid backstory to the weird characters to even just the music make it a lot of fun. At the end of the day, I really do hope the Haunted Mansion can continue a streak of remaining pretty much untouched for at least a little while longer. Just about everything in that ride is great enough on its own that I think it's earned its spot as one of the best dark rides out there.
Oh, the Haunted Mansion's always been one of my favorites. Hitchhiking ghosts,